Hello. Today in my writing process playlist, I'm going to start the outlining phase of my book, the official outlining phase. I did some proto outlines before this, but this is the final hurrah before I actually get into the writing process. So I'm going to start with this question. Should you include a map in your book? Well, I think if it's fantasy, that's a hard yes. Now, I have seen them in other books. I don't think it's always necessary. In fact, sometimes I think it takes away from me imagining the surroundings in my head if there's too much of that. However, I think if a book has complicated geography and some kind of quest, then, especially if it's kind of like epic fantasy, Lord of the Rings kind of thing, then I think a map is a good idea. Now, my book is not that. My book is a sort of spiritual noir mystery. So you're probably wondering, why am I making maps? Well, I am making these, but I'm not going to include them in the book. These are purely for me to understand my world better and for me to keep things straight in my head. So they are kind of like an outline. They're a visual outline as opposed to a text outline. I made my maps in a program called Incarnate. The link is below if you want to check it out. You can do up to 10 maps with their kind of limited interface for free, which is pretty cool. I didn't make that many. I have probably about a half a dozen, and only a few of them are like the really important locations. Why did I make them? My story is set in the future. It's the future northwest of the United States. And it is several hundred years in the future, although I don't think this is a futuristic book. It's more of like retro future. But the book takes place after several natural disasters and many events in the time between the present day and this time. So several centuries have gone by. So the cities and the coastline and the landmarks have all changed. In making the map, it kind of helped me sort this out. Much of the planning for the story happened as I was making the map. In that case, I think it's kind of like a mind map of sorts. Different than a traditional mind map where you're kind of spoking things out from the center. But in this case, I was building this world not just as I was creating the map, but also in my head, kind of trying to figure out what goes where. And in the course of doing this, I actually came up with a lot of good ideas. These egregore sites, I'm not going to tell you what they are, but that was something that came out of the map making. I have my major locations, Hiron, which is probably where the majority of the book is going to take place. But there's a big chunk in New Jericho City, and there's also a big chunk on the Isle of La Roche. So the reason I made this map bigger than the locations that I'm using is because a lot of it is going to be information that is spoken about from people. So I needed to kind of flesh out the world around this area. So I'm basing the temple on the island off of the actual plans for the temple of Eleusis. I'm having this be sort of a reproduction of that schematic. So what I did is built it to look similar, but not exactly the same. I wanted it to have some slight differences. But, it's on a hill on the island, and, this is a very important location. I'm not going to say why. I really had to figure out kind of how you get up to the temple and what the actual temple grounds look like. I think this will help me when I actually describe it, even down to adding like rose bushes. That is going to be a big facet of one of the characters, and so even just including that little detail, where they are and that kind of thing, that just really helps me visualize it in my head. The most important location is Hiron. Hiron is kind of the complex where the cult that performs the rites lives. And this is really important to get right because I needed to kind of include the location, but I also needed to figure out where people live, because a lot of the mystery is going to be tied to how these people interact. And I think by getting this information organized, it's really going to help when I get into the writing mode, because I don't have to think about this person lives next door to that person, or this person lives across the way. That it was really helpful to figure it out. And not just that, but it made me start thinking a lot about why these people live in these different places. Some of the people live upstairs in one of the buildings, and that's for a very specific reason. There are 3 characters that I'm calling the Fates, because you need 3 Fates for the Eleusis rites, and they have their kind of own building. And they're kind of off to the side because they're a little weird, because they're the Fates. So like all those things I had to keep in mind when I was designing the map. An earlier location in the book is New Jericho, and this is kind of a city slash shanty town that has sprung up around an abandoned factory complex. It's sort of been refurbished. This is a very Detroit thing. I'm from Detroit, and this happens a lot in Detroit, and that's kind of an aspect of the novel I wanted to explore, is what would happen in the world if the entire world became like Detroit is. I really enjoyed making this map because it made me think a lot of how people do stuff in my hometown, but also how you might do it in the future when you don't have that many resources or the manpower to build big buildings and things. It was fun to make because, it again helped me come up with many ideas. This Alley of the Mirrors almost inspired an entire chapter, just because I got this idea, wouldn't it be interesting to have a mural where it's made out of a bunch of broken mirrors? And that just, my imagination went wild once I thought of that. So making the maps I think can really inspire out of the box thinking that is maybe different than if you were just doing a typical outline. So I have several other locations, but I'm not going to show the maps because they're kind of spoilers more, and they're not as in-depth as these maps. But like I said, I made about a half a dozen. So maps can do many things for you when you're designing them. They can help with ideation. Like I said, you get all kinds of great ideas from making them. They can help you visualize your surroundings, which I think is very important. Sometimes writers think, I'm just going to imagine this all in my head. And yes, you can do that. And I think if wherever you're trying to explain is relatively simplistic, I think you can pull that off. However, if what you're trying to imagine is complicated and there are many details, I just think it's easier to lay it out, and you can refer back to it constantly, and that might even give you more ideas. It can help with description, like the room size, the shape of the place, the conditions. These maps in Incarnate, you're able to put a grid on them too. So I'm going to have a version without the grid and with the grid, and the grid helps you measure distance. So you don't have to think about all that in your head. You just look and you go, it's from there to there, and it's 25 feet or something. That's just really useful. Not that I'm ever going to say, it's 25 feet away, because that's not a very writerly thing to say, but it helps you imagine the distance. It also helps you keep track of your locations, the people, the places, how they are in relation to each other. If you were to do, like, say, a murder mystery, this would be very important. I'm not doing that, but if you were doing that, I think it would be very, very wise to have a map, especially if it's in like a house, a mansion or something. Very, very useful for that. And it also helps you with the logic of the place. And what I mean by that is when I was making the Chiron map, I had to think, so this place is a kind of compound, but it also has to survive in this world that is a bit dangerous. So like, Obviously it needs a wall. Then I started thinking, well, this is a place where people live. There's certain basics that they need. Firewood, a blacksmith, you know, all these sort of medieval level needs. And the more that I thought about that, the more I kind of had to retool what I was doing, because I'd be like, oh, I forgot, they're probably going to need that. So then I had to think about that and include it. So yeah, I mean, not all of that might not end up in the novel, but for my own peace of mind, I think it's good to know that, and it just makes it feel more real. But yeah, I think this is best to do before your first draft. It helps you think out all the little details, and if you're doing that during your drafting process, I think it just slows you down. Anything that you can think about and sort out ahead of time just makes the drafting process faster. My next video, I'm going to get into my historical timeline outline, and that will deal with the kind of different events that have happened in this world up to the point where my story starts, and I will discuss that more in the next video. If you liked anything you've seen here, you can hit the bell, like button, all that stuff. So comment below if you think maps are a good idea or a bad idea. I'd like to hear some thoughts about that. So anyway, have a good day, take care, bye-bye.